Hello and welcome to the third part of our five-part series on cybersecurity masterclass. Today we're going to be meeting DfE and NCSE cybersecurity standards, defensive tactics, if you will. Today I've got Martin Wilson from the NEBRC. Martin, would you like to just give a quick intro?
Yeah, hello everybody. So I'm a servant detective inspector, as you can probably tell from my accent, based in the northeast of England, and I am seconded into the Northeast Business Resilience Centre, which is a not-for-profit that helps SMEs with cybersecurity, one of several similar centres that are across the country.
Thank you, Martin. And another of our guest speakers, Wendy Pattison, CFO and Business Director at Framwellgate School.
Hi everybody, yes, I'm Wendy. I'm working closely with Ed and Martin after quite a serious cyber incident at my school, Framwellgate School, Durham, back in September. And we're doing quite a bit of outreach work to try and support colleagues to learn from lessons that we encountered and hopefully make the world a safer place. Thank
you, Wendy. And I'm Ed Renwick, a host of the podcast series. I'm one of the partner account managers here at Acronis. And so obviously, as can we move this slide over, please, guys? As we know, in the education sector, you guys are giving guidelines, offered guidelines from organizations like the NCSE and the DfE to things like air gaps, fire breaks, and as we've seen over the years, schools have a challenge aligning to those for one of many reasons. We wanted to really pick into this because obviously Framwellgate School had a cyber attack. And Wendy, from your perspective, in terms of the DfE guidelines in particular, before the attack occurred, how much focus were you able to put on those guidelines and how meaningful were they to you?
That's a really good question. And I think before something happens to you, you think you are prepared and that you've read every document you need to and that everybody's aware of it. In reality, I'm being absolutely honest, you learn more after you've had such an incident and you realise that you haven't read things thoroughly or fully understood them thoroughly. And I don't think that's necessarily uncommon, but nor should it be an excuse. And I think really it's about understanding the guidelines are there for a reason. Thought has been put into them and they are there to help you. So I think it's really, really important not just to skim over and think, yeah, I think we're okay. We should be okay with that. This is never going to happen to us, because in reality, it will happen. It will happen to pretty much, every organization at some point in the coming years. So it is very, very important to understand where the guidance is, but what it actually means in reality. And if you don't know, ask the right questions. And a key for me, and we'll go into it in future events and discussions, is around making sure that the people who really need to know, like your trustees, your governors, your senior team, they need to know and understand as much as you do to be able to support what needs to happen in the school. For example, putting money in the right places, putting things correctly on risk registers, and fully appreciating the cost of failure.
And Martin, from your perspective, obviously, I know you work with a lot of schools up and down your region. How do you find the schools? Is that quite common? What the kind of description Wendy's just given us?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, all schools and pretty much all organisations face the same threat landscape. The critical sort of key is what's the budget to deal with that, and what's the knowledge level to deal with that's in a particular organisation. Because unfortunately, what you tend to see in this space is kind of those organisations that haven't had an incident yet, and there's kind of blissful, maybe ignorance is too strong of a word, but a kind of a blissful ignorance of the reality of how prevalent and how bad that this sort of stuff can be. And then the other side of that coin, you've got those that have had the incident, that as long as they can bounce back and learn the lessons, automatically then understand that maybe that some of the things that they can do and could do from a budgetary perspective, it isn't that expensive compared to what a real live incident is. And what I would say is, you know, Wendy and I, for those that maybe haven't watched one of the previous webinars, and I would encourage you to look at the one that's the case study of an attack that happened upon Wendy's school. But Wendy and I didn't know each other prior to that incident, which was in September. And I put myself, even though I kind of live and breathe this, as learning a hell of a lot through that incident. And the whole reason why we do these webinars, work with Wendy, work with Acronis, is to try and pass those insights on to people, to try and make sure you don't need to go through that trauma, because it is a trauma, to understand what it is that you need to do.
And Wendy, from I guess from your perspective, since the event, there's been a bit more of a focus on the guidelines. And Martin, I think your point was quite valid there. This is a balancing act for you guys, Wendy, I suspect, because it would be great to be able to take every box that the DfE are suggesting you take along with the NCSC, but you're always going to have that constraint of budget. So it's finding, I guess, that happy medium.
It's finding the balance. It absolutely is. And I've got to be honest as well, guidance isn't always straightforward from the DfE or other agencies, especially for people who don't have the finer technical knowledge. So it's about, you know, getting to the right guidance, challenging, like I said, where you don't necessarily understand it, but where you've got expertise in your own organisation. If you're lucky enough to have a talented network manager, or you use third line support, use those guys as well, because their knowledge is far more than what mine is and what other colleagues is. Use those people, but support them, understand the guidance, understand deadlines, understand what you've got to do and the risk of failure if you don't do it. What does that actually mean to you? But yes, certainly our mindset has changed because it's had to. We were, and Martin used the words blissful ignorance, and actually, that's right. You don't fail on purpose, but you maybe your eyes off the ball because you think everything's okay. You're not a bad person, you're not a bad company, but that is reality in life. But these things are there, and the good thing to come out of a bad situation is that you can learn from it and stop it happening again. And therefore, you then go back to the guidance, you go back to your risk plan, you go back to your budget, and you make sure that all of those things are tied up with the knowledge and support as well now from the trust board, governors, and your senior team.
And would you say now, looking from where you were, looking to where you are now, in terms of alignment to the guidelines that the DfE set out, would you say you're much better aligned than you were previously?
Oh, I think absolutely much better aligned, but with still work to do, and there will always be work to do because it's a shifting landscape. So I think otherwise you then fall back into blissful ignorance again. You still think you're okay. So therefore, that's why we did something we've never done before. With Martin, we did a vulnerability assessment at the time of the attack, and that's something that we're now going to build into our plans annually, is to fund and have an annual vulnerability assessment to make sure that the bad guys find the good guys find the problems before the bad guys do.
Yeah. And Martin, from your perspective, because I know you guys work with the DfE and the NCSC, how do you find in terms of their ability to engage with the schools? Is there additional, on top of the kind of support and the guidance that they give via the website, is there an ability for DfE people to speak to schools specifically, or would they interact with you guys and then move on from there?
I think we're more than happy to have conversations. We're not that precious about whether you come and speak to the cyber resilience centres first or the Department for Education centres, first. I don't think there's a right and wrong answer there, really. Our time costs nothing to have these sorts of conversations with. But I think there's tons of help and support out there. The problem is twofold. The problem is understanding that you need it, because if you're in that sort of blissful ignorance, you might not be that interested to look for it because you don't think you need it. And secondly, it's actually accessing it and actually knowing what's there. So there's a really great example, the NCSC does a level of free web checking and mail checking for schools. There's the police cyber alarm that's out there. There's all of this really good stuff which is potentially there. It's just signposting people to it. I think that's the difficulty, and understanding what the value is in those offerings.
And for the audience today, how would you recommend they do kind of embrace that? Doing it before there's an event, where would you direct them to?
Yeah, so the circle we're trying to square here is obviously we don't want an event, and therefore that's how the conversation happens. And I think each organisation's slightly different. I know Wendy and I have chatted very holistically about the challenges in the educational sector before, and sometimes you'll have a brilliant network manager, but is meeting a blocker at senior levels, and it's how do you unblock that? But as to how you access it, quite simply, you can just Google cyber resilience centres, and you'll find a map, and you'll find the contact details of how to get in contact with each one in the country. And we're not that precious. Don't feel like heads are going to be bitten off because you end up on the wrong area of the postcode. We'll get you to where it is that you need to be. And equally through some of the police protect stuff, each region as well, we can signpost you to that. The police cyber alarm has its own website. All of this is there, but if you don't know how to access it, just get in touch with people like me, and we're happy to signpost you to the right departments or the right companies.
Can I just add a little bit onto that, Ed, if that's okay? As Martin's touched on there, and we have had quite lengthy conversations, myself and Martin, the education world is vast and varied. You've got huge multi-academy trusts, some of them upwards of 90 schools. They'll be very well placed to deal with scenarios like this and to be very proactive and have the money collectively to be able to, have things in place to hopefully totally mitigate the risk, although I don't think you can ever totally mitigate a risk. However, you've got, on the other side of things, you've got small maintained nursery schools, primary schools, special schools, rural schools that have 10 kids in. But cyber attacks, I've learned, and the criminals don't discriminate against any of that. You are all vulnerable. We are all vulnerable, whether we are that small nursery or this huge trust with 90 schools. The attack will be the same, and the impact of the attack and the cost of the attack, therefore, will be the same. So everybody's vulnerable. But those who have the money, those who are in collective groups, who have the expertise, are far better placed. So I think really it's something for the Department of Education, really, I think, to advise on and try and maybe build support networks in for those smaller and arguably far more vulnerable schools where the ability to be so preventative is far less than one of the bigger organisations.
That's a really valid point, Wendy. I hadn't actually thought of that myself. And you're right. These guys are kind of out at arm's length, on working on their own in isolation. It does become limited budgets, limited people, limited resources starts proving to be challenging. What advice would you give, Wendy, to let's say a school in what you've just described there, in terms of what could they do proactively now to kind of engage with organizations, try and better align themselves, talk to people? What advice would you give them, knowing what you know now?
It's very hard for those smaller schools to do that, and there will be a limit. There will be a threshold as to what they can access, what they can afford. If you look at a say an infant school with maybe 250, 300 children, the staffing structure in those schools is very, very different to the structure I would have here at my school, Framwellgate School, Durham, because generally you've got the head teacher and a very limited team beneath the head teacher doing the work. So you might have, if you're lucky, in a smaller school, a business manager, and maybe one other administrative person. And that's your team. You'd have a caretaker. You certainly are unlikely to have a technician. You probably have got third line support. So there's no resource or capacity there really for that very limited team to even take this as a serious threat. And that's why you'll get people, glossing over this, thinking, well, on my priority list, where I've got Ofsted up here and they're coming next week, and I've got the potential for a cyber attack here, they'll go to Ofsted every time. So it's a very, very difficult one to square. And I'm not sure what the answer is unless that additional support is there. Really, what they have to understand, everybody has to understand, is this is a real threat to everybody. And it's the same attack that will happen to my school as it would to a little infant school somewhere. And the impact will be, you know, the same. It's all the same risk, it's all the same impact and the same cost. So really, it's how somehow we support those schools. And part of, I suppose, what this is doing is helping to educate, to signpost to support networks, but it's trying to get them and those people to understand this risk, and it is a real risk, and find somehow networks that can support them, whether it's educational networks together, other schools, groups of people, or it's organisations, or it's the Department for Education, like I said, hopefully understanding this bigger risk to the smaller schools and seeing what they can do to support them. It's not an easy answer, I'm afraid.
I think if I could just add to that, I mean, there are two costs here. So the first one is budget. What I would say about that is, again, through my lived experience through Wendy, I know that budgets are incredibly tight, certainly in those smaller primary schools and nurseries for the reasons that she's alluded to. But conversations with cyber resilience centres, people like myself, costs nothing. And even if we are to go on to do some work, that work's heavily subsidised. So having a conversation and seeing what something like, you know, a vulnerability assessment may cost, that costs nothing. If it's still beyond your reach, well, at least then you've kind of discounted that for budgetary reasons. So I would really encourage people to have those conversations. A lot of the tools that I've alluded to, okay, they don't tick all of the boxes, such as the details upon the Acronis solution here, but some of those are free. I guess the real conundrum here is that Wendy's alluded to, she called it resource. It's not just about money, it's about the time. And I guess, how do you add more time into, how do you make more than 24 hours? How do you make it a 30-hour day? I guess being pragmatic, like Wendy said, if you've got Ofsted next week, it's not going to be at the top of your priority list. But what about week 2? What about week 3, week 4, month 1, month 2? The longer that inaction happens, the more likelihood is that something will happen. So I guess put it in your priority stack somewhere. Don't stick your head in the sand. As easy as that is to do, would be my advice.
And one other thing, and on the back of what you're saying there, Martin, is I keep going back to the responsibility of the trust board. It's the trust in an academy, it's governors in a maintained school, but they do the same job. They are, you know, they're responsible for the same things. Ultimately, they are responsible for the organisation, the health of the organisation and the security of it. It's their responsibility. What schools can look at is trying to recruit trustees or governors from, you know, an ICT cyber background, somebody like Martin, not to give you a job, Martin, or somebody like you, Ed, you know, where good people with a huge amount of knowledge are sitting advising on these boards and can really, I mean, to get somebody like that on your board would be gold dust. But we have it for accountants. You know, we've got accountants on our board, you've got HR advisors, you've got legal advisors. Why not have a cybersecurity expert? There's more and more out there. You know, somebody like Joe, your colleague Martin, somebody like him would be gold dust to advise fellow trustees and support people like myself, people like the head teacher and your network manager. So that's something that doesn't cost anything. It costs your time if you are on that board, but you know, there are governors and trustees in every single school. So it's just trying to target that gap in knowledge in the board, and then, you know, that's really plugging a big gap there.
And I guess look, the reality of the environment we live in now, the threat landscape is only going to get worse. The guidelines are only going to get longer. There's going to be more of them, and you're still going to have those time, resource, budget constraints ahead. I think the takeaway for me from this is get in touch with people like the NEBRC. They can then signpost you to the right organizations, the right people, just as they've been able to do with Wendy to help her navigate through the storm that she's had to deal with from a malicious attack. We have now come to the end of the allotted time. Guys, I want to thank you so much for that. I hope everyone found that very useful. and look forward to the next session. We do at Acronis have some materials around how our portfolio aligns with the guidelines from the NCSC and the DfE, and they can be downloaded from our website on the education sector. And with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. Wendy, Martin, thanks again for your input today. I'm sure everybody found it very useful. Thank you.